This podcast is brought to you by the good people at Living with Hemophilia, the online hemophilia community brought to you by Bayer. Living with Hemophilia is the destination of choice for a plethora of useful info, like medical and non-medical tips, helpful advice, information on programs for all ages and stages, leadership opportunities and initiatives, sewing patterns, and videos, the best videos. And because it's on the internet, it's easy to find. Simply type livingwithhemophilia.com into your search bar, and there you are. Thank you, Internet. Join Bayer's community of fellow hemophilia patients, caregivers, and advocates as we put the live in Living with Hemophilia. You can even like us on Facebook. That's even better because you can use emojis and receive all our latest updates. So check out Living with Hemophilia. And before you wish happy birthday to that friend from 3rd grade or share a funny meme about cats and Mondays, head over to Facebook and like Bayer's Living with Hemophilia page. You'll be glad you did.
It's advocacy season, dear listeners. I've been enjoying seeing all of the red ties in celebration of Bleeding Disorders Awareness Month this March, and I'm loving that red tie challenge. Advocacy is such a strong value for our bleeding disorder community. We pride ourselves on the work we do in the advocacy and policy space, and our episode this month explores a different point of view in our advocacy work. Welcome to the Ask the Expert podcast. I am your host, Amy Board, and I'm so excited for today's episode. I've had the pleasure of watching our national advocate base grow over the past 5 years or so. I was at that Washington Day several years ago where we had over 500 advocates on the Hill sharing what means most to them. And it was incredible, and the energy was just through the roof. Our state-based organizations are expanding their advocacy programs, and our national organizations, both NHF and HFA, are dedicating massive resources towards grassroots advocacy. And I know that it can remain intimidating to normal, lovely folks who are living with bleeding disorders, and that the challenges still can occur when it comes to sharing your story with your decision makers. And that is why I have invited my guest to speak today. But before we jump in, I just want to remind you to fill out our survey so we can gather what you'd like to listen to here on the Bloodstream Network. If you haven't filled out our survey, please go here at www.bloodstreampod.com/feedback. We would love to hear your thoughts as we are kind of curating and producing these podcasts. And remember to always subscribe to our network of podcasts. Check out the Bloodstream podcast this month with Patrick and Natalie. We just launched a segment dedicated to mental health with Debbie De La Riva, who is a licensed counselor. And it's something that we should all tune into in our own lives a little bit, to turn inward and just to see how we're doing. So please check that out. We're very excited about that. I personally would love to have your thoughts and your questions for future podcasts. So you can find me on Twitter at Bordo87, and you can also email us here at mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com. So we would love to hear from you. And of course, I have to give a special thanks to Bayer Pharmaceuticals for sponsoring Ask the Expert. Without Bayer support, conversations like the one I'm having today would not happen. So we are so grateful. So let's jump in. Let's do this. Today's guest is Bruce Barnum, and he is a former staffer in Senator Al Franken's office. And I wanted to invite a former staffer because I kind of wanted to pull back the curtain on all these advocacy meetings that we're having lately. Meeting with your legislator, whether it's in Washington, D.C. or at your state house, can be very intimidating. But I've always thought that the bigger question was always, does anybody actually care about what I say? So Bruce is going to be here with us today to share what it's actually like working in a senator's office, but more specifically, how important it is for you to share your story and experiences. The one thing I took away from this conversation is that they literally cannot do their jobs without hearing from you. I've always believed personally that it's not the job of our legislators to understand what it's like living with a bleeding disorder. It really, truly is not their job to know. But I do believe that it is their job to listen. And it is our job to be compelling enough that they remember us when they need to make a decision that affects you and your family. I really do. It is our job to show up. It is our job to tell them what it is like. And it truly is their job to listen. And so today we're going to explore what it's like working in a congressional office and what to do with that courageous, enlightening information that you tell them. So grab a cup of coffee and let's have ourselves a conversation. I am your host, Amy Board, and welcome to episode 25, or our Do Our Stories Actually Matter episode of the Ask the Expert podcast. We're joined today by Bruce Barnum. Bruce is a former staffer in Senator Al Franken's office, and I am thrilled he is joining us today to talk advocacy. Hello, Bruce. Is this your first podcast experience?
Well, I certainly listen to a lot of podcasts, but I can't say I've ever spoken on one before. So in that sense, yeah, sure is.
Yay! Well, this is my third time, so we're all in this together. It's new. But we'll discuss your past work in Washington in a minute, but I would love for folks to get some background on you. You moved on into nonprofit policy work after D.C., is that correct? I met you when you worked at the MS Society in Denver, but tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, sure. No, I'm still in Denver. I currently work for an organization called the Colorado Center on Law and Policy. So as you say, we're a policy-focused organization working on poverty issues primarily at the state level here in Colorado. And before that, in between this job and working for Senator Franken, I worked at the National MS Society, right, which is where I met you. So spent a few years there. Great experience doing a lot of community engagement work, outreach work, a little bit of policy work. So yeah, that's definitely kind of my wheelhouse. And sort of back before working for the senator, I did work on some political campaigns, kind of the campaign side, which is always a good way to get a little bit engaged in the policy world. Definitely not something you want to do forever. It's certainly a difficult job, but it's
a grind.
Yeah, nonstop when you're in that campaign mode for sure.
Yeah. How did you initially become interested in policy work and get involved working with the senator?
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting question for me. I think it really goes way back in my case to really my childhood and my upbringing. I grew up in Colorado here, and my folks were not maybe super political, but they were very active. My parents were, they were really active in their community. They were active on some environmental causes. We lived up in the mountains in Colorado, and they were part of some citizen groups that were protecting some threatened areas from development and, setting aside some open space and that sort of thing, kind of back when that movement was young, and that wasn't as big of a deal as it is now. But and they participated in some campaigns and helped some folks out. So I definitely have kind of these early memories of going around, dropping off literature with my mom, or, going to what at the time I would have considered really long, boring meetings, with the county commissioners or something, or a variance hearing with my dad, and having to, sit through all that as a child. But I think, ultimately that made some impression on me that, public life and public service and policy is a place where you can really get something done and have an impact on the world you live in.
So when you were working for the senator, what were your duties within the office, and what was it like working for such a high-profile senator?
Yes. I think, for your listeners, it might be interesting to just give a little overview of sort of how a congressional office works. Senatorial offices. Yeah, just to give some context to that, I think so, both for your members of Congress and for your senators, it's a similar story. There's a staff. So, they campaign, they get elected, but once the member is elected or the senator is elected, they represent everybody. It's no longer an election thing. It's, everybody's a constituent once the election is over, and it's all about serving all of the people. So, it doesn't matter who you voted for or what party you are, your representatives are your representatives, and they're there to serve you. So, at that point, the senator or the member has a staff, paid professional staff, federal employees who serve them basically to analyze policy, to write legislation, to kind of keep abreast of current events, and to tap into what's going on in their district or in their state. So that staff, in all cases, is divided between some folks who are primarily sitting in D.C. and really kind of watching the the legislative machine run its course, and then some folks who are primarily based in the state or in the district, and those folks are interacting with legislation and with policy, and then are also sort of the conduit to the people that live back home. So in my case, I was on the state side of that. So I lived in Minnesota, which Senator Franken, the senator from Minnesota. And so I, would go to D.C. here and there on occasion, but spent most of my time in Minnesota really working with people and organizations and folks in Minnesota to figure out what people needed, what good policy solutions are, and that's really the way in which that policy gets made. In a lot of ways, is it's not some idea that just sort of appears from thin air, but it's ideas that come up from people that are living in the state and are saying, hey, we're having a problem with this, or there's an issue here, or we need help with this, and vice versa. When policy ideas are proposed, then a lot of our job on the state staff is to take those policies out to people in the state and vet them and see what people think about them and get feedback and make adjustments and make sure that the policy solutions that we're working on are fitting the needs of the people that live in the state that we're representing. So it's kind of that, as a whole, the staff really serves as that sort of conduit of democracy between the people that are being represented and their representative or their senator who represents them in the Senate. So that's a little bit of background. But for me, I think your question was somewhat about sort of working for a higher profile senator, what that was like, and definitely Senator Franken was definitely one of the better known members of the Senate outside of our own state, I would say too. So there was, always a lot of interest and questions. But when I worked for him, part of his strategy was really to make sure that he was well connected to people in Minnesota, just because he had that kind of higher national profile. So we really dug down and we spent more of our time and more of our resources in the state than a lot of Senate offices do. It's kind of up to the discretion of the senator and the senator's chief of staff how the resources are spent and how many people are sitting in D.C. and how many people are out in the state, that sort of thing. And I think that office, compared to some offices, really had a strong presence in the state of Minnesota and a lot of engagement with people, just to make sure that we were sort of extra well connected to the people that we were representing. And part of that, I think, was because there was a perception that we wanted to make sure wasn't true, that Senator Franken, because of that high national profile, was in some way less connected with folks on the ground, and we really made that the focus of our work.
So it was very important for you to hear constituent stories in order to do your job. I mean, that was kind of his mission. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I remember him saying more than once, a big sort of talking point for him, something that he really defined his tenure in the Senate around was being a workhorse and not a show horse. So you have that profile and that sort of that extra layer of fame that he has, but it was all about trying to do work on behalf of folks in the state. So as you say, input from constituents is enormously important, and it is to every congressional office for sure. And that's why you have a staff that sits in the state or sits in the district. And that spends time out there in community, going to meetings, showing up at policy events, meeting with different groups and folks who are organized, and trying to see sort of what the pulse of the people is, and to try to gather that information. And it is because ultimately, and I think this is something that everybody could agree with, regardless of party or anything like that, is the function of Congress, of the House and the Senate, is to be that representative body and to represent people. And I think there's always a high consciousness that ultimately you're responsive to the people and you're accountable to the people. They're the ones who decide if you get to keep doing the work. So it's always something I think that's top of mind is what do people think about this, and why? What feedback do you get? What do people have to say about something? So it's very, very important.
I think one aspect of our advocacy program within the bleeding disorder community is there is this perception that, no one understands what it's like to live with hemophilia or von Willebrand's disease. And it's so rare and it's so unique. We often feel uncomfortable talking about it, or we don't know how to talk about it with people that don't understand, or we're frustrated. I've seen that sometimes before where, they had no idea what hemophilia was. And I guess for you, how often did you sit with, groups of people that you had no idea, chronic diseases that you had no idea, what their struggles were? How important was it for you to be educated by people that came into your office to tell you guys, what their daily struggles were?
Yeah, it's very important, I think, and I think it's very impactful, especially in a case like what you're talking about with disorders like hemophilia, and having worked now at the National MS Society too, I have a lot more experience with it even. But, in those days working for the senator, when you're in that position and you're, one of a handful of staff members that sort of has to cover the vast policy landscape and absorb all of the information and the input that's coming in, it's really helpful to have people who are able to come to you or, be at meetings with you or attend events with you and really tell those stories, and describe what it's like. Because exactly as you say, nobody who hasn't lived with that knows what it's like to live with that. And, same for many other conditions and disorders that are out there. It's a powerful personal experience that people have of that, and sharing that, and I know, of course, that it's not comfortable for everybody, and it can be challenging, but being able to share as much as you can or as much as you're comfortable with, and to be a champion for people in your community is really, really impactful. Because when you're sitting in that position and you're working for an elected official, and you have to take all of this information and make it into something that's usable, that makes sense, that makes sense in terms of policy. It is really important to be able to connect that to people. And I know that's something that we always were looking for whenever a policy proposal was on the table or a policy proposal was up for debate, is how do we make this about people? How do we make this about people's stories? How do we make this about individuals? Because I can tell you that, really putting life to a piece of policy and really putting the human element to it is a crucial element of making sure that it's the right policy, but also of getting something passed. If you're trying to make a policy change, you really have to be able to tell people why this is going to change or impact people's lives for the better. And I think that, that story can't be told without the stories of the people, the real people, not just kind of the general information or the statistical information, which has its place, but you really have to have the stories of the people who are going to, be living with the consequences of a piece of policy or a piece of legislation, and have to be able to share that and put that into part of the debate.
What components or elements of a constituent story made them stick out? Do you remember? I mean, what were some that you remember?
I heard so many stories, and it's one of those jobs where you just you do get to hear a lot of people's stories, and people are willing to share with you, which is tremendous. But it's also powerful, to be the recipient of those stories. And I think I definitely remember people's stories that are people really struggling with something, or people really a lot of times struggling with something and finding ways to overcome it and trying to bring that to someone else. I think I remember a lot of stories about people who had, struggled with something, whether it was, disease or an economic condition of poverty or, some personal struggle like that, and, were able to make a change, make an impact in their own lives, and, seeing the people around them in their community and wanting to bring that out. And that always, I think, was something that was pretty inspirational to me, was to be able to hear from people that could say, hey, I had a major struggle in my life, and, this thing helped me, and this thing should be available to others, or this resource should be out there, or this piece of information should be out there, and what can we do to make that happen? Because, I think in part because it's inspirational, but also in part because it's, it's operational. You can take something like that and say, hey, if we could just provide this group of people with this resource or this piece of information, we could make a difference. And I think that's something you're always looking for when you're in that position, and when you're trying to serve your elected official, your member of Congress, is what's something that's out here that we can do something about, that we can take action on, And we ran a lot of bills, from time to time that seemed probably sort of in the grand policy landscape, especially at the federal level when you're talking about, billions of dollars and this and that, and all these huge bills that you sort of see in the top of the news. But, we did a lot of bills. Like I remember we did one on service dogs for, military members and veterans, and, something like that can be tremendously helpful, right? And it seems like you're working on, something so minor in the context of all the giant things that are going on in the federal government. But when you can make a small change or create a policy that's going to really help, even a few people, that can be really rewarding. And frankly, I think that's something that is important to realize, especially about the federal landscape, is change is hard. Our system of democracy is set up such that making big changes is, it's slow and it's difficult. You have checks and balances, you have different branches of government. It's not easy to just come in and, say, here's my sweeping new idea and I'm just going to get it done. It doesn't usually happen like that.
Right.
It's rare. It usually takes some sort of a crisis or something to precipitate big major change. But you can do a lot of things which are not necessarily headline grabbing, but they really help people, and that's that I think is often the most fulfilling work you can do in a position like that. So it's I think people shouldn't be afraid to tell their story, and they shouldn't imagine that it's never going to happen or it's going to take some huge thing to make this better. A lot of times those things that are sort of straightforward, simple things that can help people are the things that everybody's willing to vote for.
Have you checked out Living with Hemophilia yet? If you have, kudos to you. Not only are you eager to join the exciting community of discourse and helpful information, you're also a keen listener and patron of the arts. But if you haven't taken a swim through livingwithhemophilia.com, take a moment to pull it up on the ol' internet. I think you'll love it. Helpful content, relevant updates, and, most of all, a bunch of people going through the same things you are. It's a growing part of the online Living with Hemophilia community, brought together by the good people at Bayer. Also, put it on your Facebook to-do list. Hit the like button on the Living with Hemophilia Facebook page. It's a good alternative to looking at the slideshow of your neighbor's recent foot surgery. Unless you're into that sort of thing. Living with Hemophilia from Bayer. Check it out.
You mentioned that you met with so many people, and I remember when I first went to DC to advocate. It was years ago, but I was so intimidated. It was terrifying, and I remember going through the meetings day after day, realizing, oh my gosh, this is what they do all the time. It really was part of the daily work you guys did, is meet with people and to hear their stories. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So it's really a fundamental piece of the work, and I think, you have to hear constituent feedback, and you have to hear from people, and especially having groups like the one you were in, like the one I've been in before, for chronic disease. It's a powerful way to keep people organized and to put people together into a group where, those voices can be amplified and they can, speak together to a purpose, and those individual stories can be combined into something which is, more powerful than any one person's voice on their own. But, whether you're doing that or you're speaking out individually, it is, I would say not only sort of the one of the primary functions, but, really one of the primary constitutional duties of your elected representatives is to listen, and sometimes it's something that's fixable and can easily be something can be done about it, and sometimes people want to tell you about something that's going to be really difficult or something that's virtually impossible to do something about. But either way, your representative is there to hear what you think and to try to bring your human experience as a person who is represented into representative democracy that way. So it's definitely a major function, and I think one thing that's interesting, and I always think this is part of everybody's experience when they go to D.C. is it is kind of intimidating, right? And there's, the big offices and the big doors and, all the buildings and the security and stuff.
Bruce, everything is marble. It's very intimidating.
Yeah, everything is marble. Yeah, everything's very shiny. Everything's very clean.
It's very fancy.
Yeah, it's very fancy, and it doesn't seem very much like, wow, this is where, where I'm at the center. It seems like a very sort of, regal institution, and you're right, just the architecture is kind of harkening back to ancient Rome or something, and you think, wow, this is something else, and even people that go there a lot, I think, get kind of amped up about all that. So I always say, it's important to remember, a couple of things. One is that your legislator, your representative is just a human being, just like you are, and don't lose sight of that. It's not all about all these titles and stuff. It's people talking to people, and the staff that work there are staff that work there because they want to help people, almost entirely. So it's folks that want to listen to you, they want to help you, they want to see what they can do, they want to do a good job representing their constituents. So it's people to people, and it's it seems intimidating, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And having worked with and known a lot of those people, they're totally human. So it's no reason to be intimidated by that necessarily. But another thing that I always like to tell people and mention to people is kind of that component where there's staff that are sitting in D.C. I think it's always a good idea. Most groups do that. They have sort of those field trips to D.C., and those can be great. Opportunity to talk to some of the staff in D.C., but I always tell people don't forget about the staff in your district or in your state. Every senator, every representative has offices back home, wherever they represent you from, and they're there a lot personally. They travel back and forth all the time. I know for us it was every week. The senator would come back and we'd have a full schedule every weekend, and then back to D.C., just flying back and forth. And even when the senator or the member isn't in the state, the staff are there, and they're looking for people to talk to and looking for people to meet with and trying to be out in the community. And a lot of times it's almost best to go to those state offices and meet with people, because you can usually be a little bit more. You can usually have a little bit more time, and it's not quite as intimidating because it's usually not so marbly. So it's I always tell people, go to the district office, go to the place where you live. If you can't go to D.C. this year, or when you're not going to D.C. the whole rest of the year, the other probably 360 days, find your district office, find out who the staff is there. Everybody I knew of had field staff and healthcare policy staff, sitting in the state, sitting in the district, interacting with all of the different healthcare groups in the state, and they're just as open for business as the folks in D.C. are, and a lot of times they're a little bit easier to, spend more time with and get to know a little bit better, because you can visit them more often and have more dialogue. And, I always say there's, the D.C. office, there's always the sort of, the D.C. inside the Beltway, sort of the constant roar, it's like living under a policy waterfall or something. There's just so much going on all the time. And I think, when you work on the state side, it's a little bit easier to, be back in your district or back in your state and sort of separate issues out. And, it's even more about the people there. So, don't look just to DC. I think, your representative is available where you live too. So
I wish this was videoed. I realize that the whole point of this is that it's not a video, but I wish there was a video, because when you started talking about going to like your district office or, your office, back home, I was like, yes, that's where I wanted to take this. That's so fantastic. And I think I forget about it. I was ahead of our grassroots advocacy campaigns all the time, and I forgot about it too, that, when we really had something that was important to us, it was difficult to even remember. And I guess I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the timing of it. Does it matter when constituents come in? You guys are there all the time? What is the etiquette to that? Can you just call and, try to get, an organized group with their local regional chapters? What's the etiquette with it?
Yeah, well, so there's definitely, I think just sort of general business etiquette applies. You always want to be polite. You don't have to be excessively formal, but it's always good to be just sort of polite and professional. But it's it's definitely a resource that I think is sometimes overlooked or undervalued sometimes by advocacy groups. Is you do have staff sort of right in your backyard. I know. I'm right now sitting in my office in, close to the Capitol in Denver here, close to the Colorado Capitol. But I know just down the street here, even though, we're mostly working on state work, I know just down the street from us we have the office of Senator Michael Bennet in Denver. His local district office is just down the way, and then Congresswoman Diana DeGette, who represents kind of the Denver-based congressional district, she has an office a few blocks from here. So, you can't forget that those folks are here too. And I think, in terms of etiquette, it's if you have a particular policy area, say it's healthcare, typically there's going to be somebody that specializes in that state office or in that district office, and it's always a good idea to reach out and just say, hey, we're a group and we have something we want to talk to you about related to healthcare. Can you put us in touch with the healthcare person? And they will do that. There's folks there that answer the phones at the front desk. They're usually some of those younger folks just out of college, kind of getting one of those entry level jobs that gets them a lot of great experience. They may not be the policy expert yet, but they're there to sort of manage the traffic, just like in a lot of offices. You have people that are kind of doing that, and you can also send a letter. Same way, they open every piece of mail in a congressional office. Everything gets looked at, even though there's a lot. But that's why you usually have a few of those kind of 20-somethings in the office who are kind of there to dig through everything and make sure everything gets to the right people. And I know when I was in that position, I was working on a lot of rural issues and some agricultural issues and some renewable energy issues and various pieces of the portfolio, and people would always make sure that you got the mail that you were supposed to get, and that you got the messages you were supposed to get, and then once you've kind of figured out who the best person is as a point of contact in that office, you could definitely build up a relationship. I think it's it's true, especially true at the federal level, that policy work is long term. It takes a long time to get stuff through the federal process. It's that way sort of by design, but having a good relationship and having that open line of communication is just invaluable. So, I think most typically you should always find that the folks in those offices are, they're there for you and they're happy to meet you, and it's don't be afraid to ask. I mean, definitely being polite is always helpful, but I think in terms of etiquette, you don't have to. You don't have to get quite so dressed up to go into all the marble buildings as you do in D.C. either. So that's a little bit nice too.
That's a plus. That is a plus. When it comes to crafting a story, we in the bleeding disorders community, we're very lucky that we're very organized, and we have 2 national organizations that prioritize advocacy. One of the things that we work on is crafting those stories. And how important is it to have the constituent really tie their story to a piece of policy or a budget request? How important is it to have that ask and to have the story really emphasize the importance of that ask?
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely important if you have a particular objective, and I think you're right. It's good to be part of a group that has some real strong advocacy organization like that, because usually then you have a developed agenda, you have some ideas of some things you may want to accomplish, which is really helpful. And if that's what you're setting out to do, I think it is really helpful to tie everything to a specific idea or a proposal. I would never say that, those stories, those personal stories are without value, even if they're not tied to a policy proposal. It's always good to hear people's experience, regardless. I mean, you can file it away. You can, sort of store that information for later regardless. But if you're really sort of agenda driven and you're looking to get something passed or make an impact on something, then having those stories really tie in is very, very useful because, when you're trying to get something passed at the federal level, again, you really need to humanize it. You need to make it about real people. It can't just be sort of an abstract policy idea. I think that's, policy ideas probably seem abstract to a lot of people, and a lot of times they kind of are. But the ones that work, the one that get passed, they tend to be the ones that have that strong human context. So, if there's an agenda on the table, if there's, here's the 1, 2, 3 things that we're trying to accomplish, we're organized around our advocacy like that. Figuring out how those stories can specifically fit in, and what would be different, right? I mean, here's just like telling any good story, you want to talk about what's difficult, what's challenging, what the challenges are that face someone who's living with such a disorder, what life is like, and then hey, here's something that would help. Here's how it connects to a policy proposal. Being able to make that direct connection is extremely useful, extremely valuable. So I think it's everybody's story has validity, whether it connects or not. But if you want to get something done, then it's definitely a great idea to have stories that connect to it directly.
So after advocates share with you, what does staff do with that information? How is it evaluated, and how does it go directly into the policy making, process? Does it actually affect policy? Let's be honest, Bruce. Does it actually affect it?
Yeah, it does. And I think sometimes more than people realize. It sort of seems like, gosh, there's just this ocean of feedback, pouring in all the time. And it's true, there's a lot. And that is always, I think, the challenge of staff. That's the challenge of that job in a lot of ways is figuring out how to synthesize and analyze all of the feedback and all of the information to make it as useful and impactful as possible. But that's what those staff are there for. That's what they're trying to do, is to figure out, how can I take all these stories that I'm hearing and all this input and feedback and turn it into something useful. So I'll tell you, say typically, you have a district meeting, or a meeting out in D.C. So you sit down with staff, you tell them your stories, you talk about your policy agenda, you talk about what you want to accomplish. Really useful, definitely in that case, if you have a specific ask or an agenda, is to have that, written up, printed out, so you have some copies for the staff members so they can retain all that. I mean, we always took just vast amounts of notes, but it's always good to have some stuff, direct from the folks that are trying to get something done, because that, that just makes it easier to replicate the information. But usually from every one of those meetings, we would go and we would write a memo or a briefing, and then that would make it into our staff discussion. So then the staff meets pretty much all the time and shares information. And one of the biggest parts of that is taking all of these notes and these memos from each of these meetings and, synthesizing that and saying, hey, we had a meeting with, this group, the blood disorder group, we met with them, and they had, they're looking to get this bill passed, or they're looking to make this policy change. They had some powerful personal stories from some folks who were affected. They've got some good facts and information mustered to their cause. Here's how it fits in with other feedback we're getting, maybe, from another similar group or something like that, and try to put that in context. But, everything gets captured. I mean, that's a big part of that job is really, taking those notes, documenting all those meetings, documenting all those interactions, and putting them in. And then, sort of aside from those direct meetings, the other thing you get of is a lot of phone calls, a lot of emails, a lot of physical mail, and that all gets documented too, every piece of it. So everything that comes in, everybody that writes in, this shocks a lot of people, but definitely in our office, and I think this was, generally true, is that every piece of mail that came in got opened, got read, got, categorized. If it needed to go directly to somebody, it went there. But, a lot of letters you get are just folks that write in and say, hey, I want to let you know that I'm your constituent, and I support, this piece of legislation, or I oppose this piece of legislation, or I'm in favor of this idea against this idea. All of that gets tabulated, and there's a report that gets created, and every week everybody gets to look at it, everybody on staff, and say, wow, 3,000 people wrote in this week, called in this week, and, they were opposed to this. And 1,000 people called in and they were in favor of it, and that all gets tracked and paid attention to, and it's
Wow.
it's not at all. Yeah, it's a huge information. Again, those 20-something folks in those offices, they're kind of getting those. Those, they have a hard job too. They have to process all of that volume of communication. That's just kind of the for or against, weighing in on things, but they do, and they, it gets brought right to the senator's attention, and he or she gets to see and say, wow, okay, there's a lot of people really care about this issue, or, if we're hearing crickets, that says something too, so it's it's important to speak up and make your voices heard, because it gets noticed, it gets noticed what's important to people and what's not. So it's important to use your voice. I mean, it's I think a lot of people think that their voice doesn't matter, or think that their vote doesn't matter, or something like that. But it does. People are paying attention. Even way up there at the federal level, which seems, I think, sometimes so far away from your daily life. But it's that's what those offices exist for, is to translate all of that. Put it into your senator or your member of Congress's ear and say, hey, people back home really care about this issue.
That's fascinating, because at times it really does feel like a black hole. You can call and leave a voicemail, or you can write a letter, and, you just, you don't know if it's making any difference, or you're not going to do anything because, how in the world are they going to take all of that information? It's fascinating to know that it really, it really is. It's very important, and you guys work so hard to kind of collect all of that. My goodness.
Yeah, no, it's quite an undertaking. I was certainly impressed when I started there that because I didn't know before I worked in one of those offices, quite to what extent that information was all being tabulated and analyzed. And I will say, unless you write in or you call in and you really specifically ask for a response, you're usually not going to get like a letter back. If you just write in and say, hey, I support this, but it is going to get counted, it is going to get tabulated, it's going to get noted. There's such a volume that, unless people really want an answer on something and ask for it, so that's another tip. If you want to hear something back, you have to ask to hear something back, because there's so much coming in all the time that, they're going to separate those letters and say, hey, here are people that, that want a response on something, that want to hear back from us about something. And then folks will work on that. There's those, again, a lot of those folks who are kind of not so much the policy staff, but more the constituent service staff, they're usually called. Those folks are there to respond to things too. So they will, write letters back to folks on large numbers of topics. I know I don't remember exactly the numbers, but it was always, the number of letters sent out back to people by the office was always in the several hundred a week.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so there are thousands of letters coming in, but there are hundreds of letters going back out too to people that have requested responses. And usually there's, if it's a particular issue, there's a official response to it. The senator says, hey, this is what I want to tell people that write in and ask about this, and want an answer, and then those constituent service staff are charged with writing back to everybody and saying, hey, here's what your senator thinks. So it is possible to get a response too. I think that's something else people don't realize. You just have to make sure you ask for it,
right.
And people will get back to you. Yeah.
Oh, Bruce, this has just been so wonderful. I think it's so valuable to hear what it's like on the other side, and to, I don't know, just to instill some confidence in folks that, your voices really do matter, and it's so important. I mean, my goodness, hemophilia is so rare. It is so important for our decision makers to know, what it's like living with a bleeding disorder. So I just thank you so much. And in closing, I just wanted to see if you had any encouragement for our advocates. We're preparing for Washington Days, and, we're in our State House Days season. Everybody's doing a State House Day. And I just wondered if you had any encouragement for our advocates as they go forward.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And I think, it takes bravery, and it takes, definitely some fortitude to, go to Washington or to go to your state capitol and to do one of these trips, one of these action days, and to go meet with folks. But I'm always so encouraged and so happy to see people doing it. I think, the core, the nature of democracy, really requires citizens and people to step up and make their voices heard. And when you can do that, especially, as you say, something like hemophilia, bleeding disorders, it's a rare thing. And it's something people need to hear about, just like when I worked at the MS Society or any other thing that's, not sort of at the front of everybody's experience or the front of everybody's mind. It's something that the people who care about it, the people that are living with it, or the people that are, that love or care about someone that it's living with, one of those conditions, really speaking up makes a huge difference, because it generates tremendous amounts of awareness. It generates tremendous amounts of understanding. It generates tremendous amounts of new information. And your folks who are out there, being your representative or working for your representative, they're not the experts in everything. They kind of have to be the generalists in everything. So it's really important for them to hear those stories and that information, and to become more educated and more aware, so that they can do a better job of representing you. And I think that's how democracy works at its best, is when people speak up for themselves or for others that they care about, and are able to translate that into political power. And those voices need to be heard. So I encourage everybody who's preparing for those advocacy days to really give themselves a pat on the back and say, hey, I'm taking a courageous step forward, but my voice and the voices of others who aren't able to speak up right now are going to be heard because of that, and that's so very important.
Thank you again, Bruce, for joining us today, and thank you for shedding light on something so valuable to our community. We truly appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Listeners, be sure to check out your local State House Day information. Most chapters organize a specific day where you can advocate on behalf of the community, so go to your chapter's website for more information. And that is all for episode 25 of the Ask the Expert podcast. We'll be back next month with another expert interview.
Have you checked out Living with Hemophilia yet? If you have, kudos to you. Not only are you eager to join the exciting community of discourse and helpful information, you're also a keen listener and patron of the arts. But if you haven't taken a swim through livingwithhemophilia.com, take a moment to pull it up on the ol' internet. I think you'll love it. Helpful content, relevant updates, and, most of all, a bunch of people going through the same things you are. It's a growing part of the online Living with Hemophilia community, brought together by the good people at Bayer. Also, put it on your Facebook to-do list. Hit the like button on the Living with Hemophilia Facebook page. It's a good alternative to looking at the slideshow of your neighbor's recent foot surgery. I mean, unless you're into that sort of thing. Living with Hemophilia from Bayer. Check it out.
BloodstreamMedia.com is your one-stop shop for all of Bloodstream Media's podcasts for the bleeding disorder community.
Once on BloodstreamMedia.com, don't forget to follow the links to subscribe to the Bloodstream podcast, Ask the Expert podcast, the Powering Through podcast, and the Bloodline podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Have an idea for a future episode of Ask the Expert? Have a question that you would like to hear an expert answer?
Email us at mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com. You'll also find Bloodstream Media on facebook.com/bloodstreammedia and on Twitter @bloodstreaminfo.
This episode of Ask the Expert was written by Amy Board.
Produced by Patrick James Lynch.
Rob Bradford.
Joshua Sterling Bragg.
Avra Friedman.
And Colby Crow. Artwork by Katie Wright-Mead.
And Ryan Geelan.
And the Ask the Expert podcast is edited by Allison Stoney.
I'm your host, Amy Board, and until next time, embrace that mystery and fear of life. You are not alone.